The very first step in creating this blouse is that we need to attach the yoke piece to the bottom of the bonnet. Now you can kind of see that the bodice piece is larger than the yoke piece, and so I used white thread to kind of help you see that I've run 2 rows of gathering stitches. So we're going to pull those stitches up to make this piece fit this piece. And then we pin right sides together. So you can kind of see that I've pulled up the gathering stitches, and this is basically, going to be the armpit area. And then you'll notice too, over here on the end, there's a little bit of excess fabric. That's basically the seam allowance, because once it is sewn, let me flip it over. Once it is sewn with the 5/8 inch seam allowance, in order to get that straight line, we need to match these points up. So the next thing after we have gathered and pinned the pieces is to then sew along this line. When I am sewing a gathered seam, I always have my gathers facing up, and when you get ready to start sewing, I just hit the back stitch button, so then my stitches will stay in place. They won't come out. And with gathered stitches, you want them as evenly spaced as possible. So I've kind of done that in the pinning, but you will see that as I'm stitching, I'm going to take out my pin and I kind of rearrange this section so that it's even. And again, here we come up, and you might need to refold. And again, we're going slow because we have some beginners. As you get more well-versed at stitching such seams, then you can go a lot more quickly. And we'll get our gathering stitches out of the way. And we're almost there to the end of the seam. You can see this is where we had a little bit of extra fabric at the end, but we're going to hit the rewind button so that it'll back stitch, and then we just lift it up and trim. Next, we'll head over to the ironing board. This is where I inspect that I haven't gathered or stitched any fabric that I wasn't supposed to. So I kind of take a look at the seam close up. Okay, this is good. So what I can do next then is remove these gathering stitches, because we don't need those anymore. And since I also did it in a coordinating white thread, I don't want that showing. So I'm going to pull these out, and then I'm going to press that seam so that it lays smooth. So we'll do that next step. For removing our gathering stitches, we just pull them out. If you've done a loose enough stitch, they come out really easily, okay? And then you're just left with your final stitch. And then I'm going to spread it out on the board, just like this. And then because we're going to have another yoke piece encasing this seam, I want this seam to face up towards the neckline. So then I'm just pressing, do a little bit of starch. Okay, so I start on the gathered side. Now, for those of us who don't have gravitational feed irons, sometimes it takes a second to warm up. But I'm just pressing that seam up. And then we're going to flip it over. And then we're going to do this side just to make a nice flat seam. For really professional looking garments, your number one tool, in my opinion, is your iron. And it just lays beautifully now. The pieces have been pressed and it is starting to look like the front of a blouse. You can see here's where the armhole is going to be, the shoulder and the neckline, and then this is the front of the blouse. This is where that extra bit of fabric was when we pinned and then sewed together, and you can see on this side I've already cut that off. So now we have a nice straight line. And then these soft gathers, I'm really pleased with how they turned out. Now we're focusing on the back of the blouse, and you're going to start with 2 pieces and you're going to sew those together. So basically I pinned them and then sewed the seam allowance, and you can see on the bottom again there's a couple of tails on the bottom here, the excess fabric seam allowance, and I can just now trim those to get the perfect point, because now we're going to attach this to the lower bodice, and there's a few things that you need to do to prepare. So it has us reinforce this center. If you can see my stitches here, and I've gone back and forth, that's because we're going to cut, and we want to make sure we want to cut down the center but not into the stitching. And then they want us to run gathering lines on either side. And then lastly, while the bodice is still flat, they want to make sure that you mark the gathering lines as indicated on the pattern below. And can you see that? The faint red line. So how I do that is I take tracing paper and I have a tracing wheel and I lay my pattern down where it's supposed to be, and then you just go back and forth with your tracing wheel. And then let's see if I can get in there for you guys to see where those lines are. They're very faint, but once it's up underneath the sewing machine light, you'll be able to see that. And so then I'm going to run gathering stitches here. And so after we've done those 3 steps, we will then start gathering to attach this piece. Okay, I have slightly gathered and pinned up the yoke pieces to the bottom bodice. And I've used 3 pins where it comes to a point, and you can see that's where I clip the fabric. So when we sew, then we have to then pivot. You'll kind of see me doing that when I am at the machine. I'm going to be totally honest that whenever I do this type of method, I normally have to sew it 2 or 3 times before it lays correctly. This can be a bit of a tricky seam, but maybe this time will be different. Using a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, and I'm going to hit the back stitch button at the beginning of my sewing so that my stitches will be secure. Moving the gathering stitches out of the way. And approaching the gathering, laying out and smoothing the fabric along the way. Taking out my pins if I remember. I'm horrible about that. Please don't yell at me. You know, for me, slow and steady always wins the race. Okay, so now we're coming up to where we're going to be pivoting. And that's right on this center. So I'm going to approach it, get my gathering stitches out of the way. Okay. All right. So this is where we're going to now pivot in the other direction of the seam, and that's right at the center. And I kind of massage the fabric, for lack of a better word, just to make sure we're laying down smoothly, not catching any extra fabric. And then we'll continue in the other direction. Approaching the gathering stitches, so I'm going to go slow so I don't catch anything, and that the gathers lay evenly. Okay, we're in the home stretch. Back stitch to secure. And we're going to trim. Then we're going to take out any pins. And then we're going to inspect. How does it look? It's actually not too bad. There's one little area right here, so I'm going to flip it back over. It is an even gather. I'm going to take it over to the ironing board to see how bad it actually is once it's pressed out. I have pressed out my seam, and you can see that it matches on the armhole. The gathers are nice, but I do see a little slight pucker of fabric right at the center. This side is smooth, but there's a little pucker of fabric. So when I turn it over, I can see where I gathered some excess fabric right in here. So I'm going to take my seam ripper and carefully take those stitches out and make a second attempt at re-sewing this section. Because this is a busy fabric, you know, would I be the only one to notice that? Probably, but I am a bit of a perfectionist. So I am going to re-sew this section so that I can be satisfied with it. It's okay if you do this and don't want to re-sew that area. We are now going to join the front sections to the back at the shoulders. So you can see that I have pinned this here. So you just take your front piece and you have these indicator darts. So you're going to match those, and then you just pin it together like I've done here, and we're going to sew a 5/8 inch of a seam at the shoulders and then press out those seams flat. You can see where the back yoke and the front yoke has been joined with the shoulders, and flipping that over, we are now going to sew the side seams. And so for these side seams, they are going to be French seams, which means that the seams will be encased. So unlike our shoulder seams where we join right sides together, we join wrong sides together. And I'm going to sew this in a 1/2 inch seam. And then we're going to trim that down, flip it, and sew it again. Don't worry, I will be showing this technique step by step, but our first step is to pin it together and sew it wrong sides together. We have sewn that first seam, so now I'm going to open up that seam, and by opening up I mean just flatten out where we've stitched it. I'll show you in just a second. Okay. So we're basically opening up that seam, and then we flip it over and iron right over that seam so we know it's nice and flat. And then we're going to fold it right with that seam in the center. Okay, kind of gently finagle the fabric so that in half, you're pressing right at that seam. Okay, so then when we open it, you can kind of see that that center seam is upright. Why I do that is we need to trim along that seam, and whether you have it flat on a surface or you have it like I have it, this allows you to trim more closely to that seam. So I just lay my fabric scissors right along the seam and cut it off. And sometimes, you know, I get a little too trim happy and I have to go back and restitch the seam. But that makes a really nice close trim on that seam right there. So then we're going to fold it back up again, just like this, so it's in half. And we're going to do a 1/4 inch seam, sew that down all along there. And that will result in a French seam. And I've already done the one side, so you can really see it right there. And I've pressed it to the back just as the instructions mention. So that creates a more sturdier seam, which is perfect for a work blouse such as this. We are now at instruction number 14. So this is pattern piece 5, and they want you to stitch right sides together, the two pieces, and then trim them. And then you're going to flip it so that the outside, the right side of the fabric is going to be showing. So you'll press down right where the seam is, and then you're going to stitch closed on either end, and then we're going to sew it to the front opening of the blouse. So I'll show you that in the next frame. Here is our blouse turned right side out, and you can basically see this is the right hand side of the blouse turned inside out. And this is the little strip we've just sewn, and the raw edges were stitched together, and then I pinned it to the inside of the blouse. And the reason why is after we sew it, we're going to press it open and on over to the front side of the blouse and then tack it down, stitch it along here. So, but first, we're going to stitch right along this edge. Okay, so I have finished the facings on either side. So both sides have now been complete, and we will, in the finished garment, they will lie on top of each other. The reason why this type of finish is smart is because it results in a placket that is quite sturdy, and your buttonholes won't tear out, and it really gives a nice strong surface for your buttons when you're sewing those on. So it just aids in creating a well-made, long-lasting, long-wearing blouse. So I'm really pleased. So our next step now is we're going to create the interior facing, and the purpose of that is to hide all of these raw edges. So we're going to encase those. So I will grab our facing pieces, and that will be our next step. To create the facing, we are going to join the shoulders together. But first, they're asking us to iron up 3/4 of an inch or the seam allowance of 5/8 on the edges. And this is what it looks like after you have ironed it up. And then we're basically going to flip the piece over so it's right sides together and stitch along the shoulders to create our facing. So I'm going to pin these and stitch, and I'll show you the result in the next frame. I have turned the blouse inside out, which you can see down here, and then draped it over my dress form. If you don't have a dress form, you can do this on a tabletop, or if you want to use another individual, you're basically matching up the shoulder seams and pinning them, and right at the front, let's see if it'll focus, you're folding that under so it's just a little bit shorter than your front blouse edge. And then you're just pinning around the neck, because you're going to sew along the neck, and you're going to use your sewing machine to sew along the shoulders. But this along here, and then this edge, we're going to hand stitch that so that it's almost invisible. So, and then you can basically see, we're going to flip this up to its seam allowance and pin that in place, and then we'll hand stitch that as well. But again, so we're going to use the sewing machine to sew around the neck and the shoulders, and then the other edge we're going to hand stitch that close, so it just makes for a beautifully finished blouse. I'm almost done with the hand stitching. You can kind of see this is all tacked down now. Now, what I'm trying to do is where we sewed that seam, there's like now a double thickness of fabric. So I am catching only that fabric and then just the very edge of the facing of the lining. So then that way my stitches aren't showing on the front. I am doing a little bit of a different collar than what is in the pattern. I have cut out a rolling collar style, and it is 2 pieces, and so I have them pinned right sides together. On one side I did add a bit of interfacing, so I am just going to sew the seam allowance along the end edges and this edge, and then I'll be pinning this open edge once I get it flipped out onto the neck of the bodice. I stitched up the collar together. You can kind of see, and I trimmed it down a little bit, particularly on the corners. You always want to trim those down so you can get a nice sharp point. And then I sewed it to the neck edge, leaving the other side of the collar open. And then what you do is that you then bring it down to the seam line. You have your seam allowance ironed down, and then you just pin it in place. And again, you're just going to slip stitch this closed, and it makes a nice collar. To make up the sleeve, it is a historical sleeve style in which it has 2 pieces. So you have your undersleeve, which is right here, and then your upper sleeve. Now, really easily, you're going to run a gathering stitch, and you can kind of see I've marked with pins, because you can't really see the threads, where the starting and stopping points are, and that is indicated on your pattern pieces. You're also going to run an ease stitch here and here. Ease stitch is very similar to gathering. And then where you're going to add your placket, you can see I've done some reinforcement stitching. This is very similar to what we did for the yoke piece, and that's just pivoting the seam allowance, because we're going to clip that corner after we add the placket. So you'll also then want to pay attention on the pattern pieces down where the sleeve placket is going to be. This is your big circle. And then it's also indicated, let me see if I can show you, on the bottom of the undersleeve. And why that is important is because that is where you stop stitching on the sleeves. So here you can see I've put right sides together, and I've stopped right at where the large circle indicates. So flip it out for you, okay? And you can see that the reason why I stopped there is because we're going to make a placket here. And the placket pieces are 9 and 10. So you have 2 sets of those. And so I'm going to get those pinned on. Again, it's going to go right sides together, and we're going to stitch them on. So we're going to have a finished seam for that sleeve. So we'll do that step next. For the first side of the placket, this is pattern piece number 9, and I have taken the piece and placed right sides together. I've lined up the little notches and pinned it in place, and we're going to sew a 5/8 seam allowance, just straight up right there. And then we're going to fold it over. So here you can see, let me unfold it. Okay, so that's where I stitched it, and then I ironed it flat. There's the seam. And then once we fold it over, then we're going to bring that piece just like that, and then we're going to stitch right along the edge. So then that finishes the sleeve seam very nicely. For pattern piece number 10, the opposite side of the placket, there is a small circle indicated on the pattern piece, which I put a red pin to alert that that's where I need to stop sewing on this seam. So this is the inside of the sleeve, and I put the right side on the inside of the sleeve and then just stitch 5/8. So then when you flip the sleeve over, and here's the placket you just sewed, you're then going to fold it on the fold line, and it has a sharp point at the top, and it encloses this other placket that you just finished. And then we're going to sew right here and along this pointed arrow right there, and then that will finish off the inside of the sleeve. This is what your finished placket will look like, and you can see that it finishes off the edge very nicely. And now we are ready to sew up the remaining side of the sleeve. So you just pin, and you can kind of see I did a 5/8 inch seam allowance all the way up. And then the next step is we're going to add the cuff to the bottom, and then it will actually be time to put the sleeve head into the bodice armhole opening, and that's where these gathers are going to come into play. And I also marked the top of the sleeve with a pin because that is going to be pinned to the shoulder seam. And then we'll pull up the gathers to fit the armhole. All right, we are almost there. These are very labor-intensive sleeves. Keep your chin up. You are going to put the cuff piece to the bottom of the sleeve, right sides together, and stitch the seam allowance all along. And then once you finish with that, on either end, you're going to join the two ends together. And then you'll trim the corners on each side and then flip the cuff. And what I mean is you're going to flip it and then fold under the seam allowance, and then this gets hand stitched to finish it off, and then we will add a button closure. So here is our armhole with the sleeve head pinned to. This is the tie for the back of the blouse, and I have stitched two of the ends together, okay? And then it says to fold it in half and pin it, which you can see I've added my pins at regular increments. And then we're just going to stitch all down the length of this edge with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. and then we're going to flip that out. And I've done that on previous videos. I will link to my favorite methods down below in the description box on how to turn the tie right side out. The tie has been turned inside out and the ends have been hand stitched closed. And now, if you remember, on the back of the bodice several steps ago we had run 2 rows of gathering stitches. So we're going to take the center of the tie and pin it to the center of the bodice, and then we're going to pull those gathering stitches to the stitch line, and that is indicated on the pattern piece. So right there we have that. So I've already done this side. You can see how it's slightly gathered and pinned. And now I'm just going to pull these gathering stitches until the fabric fits within this section. And then you're just going to stitch to hold it in place in this long rectangle. I have added some buttonholes to the front placket. It's kind of the lighter blue right here. And then there's a hem. And I just did this on the machine. Extant examples also show machine stitching on the hem. It's getting tucked into a skirt. It's been a long day. I just want to get it done. And on the back, that is the pleated area with the belt that comes around. So the only thing left to do now is to sew on the 13 buttons.